What happened in early Celtic societies when people experienced the trauma of war or oppression? How did people deal with the sort of mass slaughter we read about in tales of battle? There are definitely clues about these things in Irish and Welsh texts. The answer is that they had ways of bringing about catharsis. What about that word, catharsis? It comes from a root meaning to purge or purify. So rather than hide pain and trauma behind a stoic mask, there were culturally acceptable ways to express them in a shared context. In Celtic myth, catharsis is frequently brought about by music experienced at a feast or by birdsong. So I'm going to explore a few texts in this video which talk about that. Before we begin, I'd like to thank my patrons on Patreon for supporting my work, and thank you if you've already subscribed to this channel. If you enjoy this video, please leave a comment, give it a thumbs up, maybe share it with your friends. And if you're a fan of my videos, then don't forget that I've got a Patreon page where you can offer me a bit more support and stay in closer touch with my work. Maybe even get your name in the credits in my next video. Now, let's get back to our subject. I hope that you've had the opportunity to enjoy that magnificent music known as the dawn chorus, when every bird seems to be singing at once in spring and summer. Even in many urban environments, it can be breathtaking and, I would argue, very healing. Sometimes even just hearing one bird can lift our mood. I'm fascinated by the goddess of Rhiannon, but for a long time I was confused about a phenomenon called the birds of Rhiannon, because there are no birds in Rhiannon's story. Even so, they were the beginning of my understanding of what I'm about to share with you. So let's look at the two Welsh stories which do mention the birds of Rhiannon. The second branch of the Mabinogi tells how a British king called Bran takes a huge force to Ireland in order to avenge his sister, Branwen, who's being mistreated by her husband, the King of Ireland. A great battle ensues in which almost everyone in both armies is killed. Bran is mortally wounded, Branwen's young son is murdered, Branwen herself dies of grief. It's a terrible tragedy. Only 7 survivors return to Britain, bearing the head of their wounded king, which magically is still able to converse with them. Bran instructs the survivors to first go to Harlech, where they will feast for 7 years, and where they will be soothed by the sweet singing of the birds of Rhiannon. In Harlech you will be 7 years in feasting, the birds of Rhiannon singing to you. The head will be as good company to you as it was at its best whenever it was on me. They do as Bran bids them, and the text describes the birds coming to them during their feast like this. And then they made for Harlech, and they began a feast, and the indulgence in food and drink was begun. And as soon as they began to eat and drink, there came 3 birds, which began to sing a kind of song to them. And when they heard that song, every other seemed unlovely beside it. It seemed a distant sight, what they could see far above the ocean, yet it was as clear as if they had been right next to them, and they were at that feast for 7 years. The men in this story have lost so much and seen great carnage. Their king understands what they will need to eventually carry on with their lives. They need to be together. They need time. They need to laugh and talk and eat and get drunk. And they need something extra. But rather than therapy or drugs, they receive the beautiful, soothing music of this very special kind of birdsong. There's only one other mention of the birds of Rhiannon. It's in another story called Culhwch and Olwen. The basic premise of the story is this. There's a bad-tempered giant called Ysbaddadan, who has a beautiful daughter called Olwen. The only trouble is that if Olwen marries, her father will die. So when the eager young Culhwch turns up at Ysbaddadan's court asking for Olwen's hand, the giant does all he can to put obstacles in Culhwch's way. Ysbaddadan sets Culhwch a list of seemingly impossible tasks that need to be done to prepare for the wedding feast, but Ysbaddadan is hedging his bets. He's also asking for things which will give him a good send-off in case Culhwch actually succeeds, because if he does, it will be Ysbaddadan's funeral feast as well. Among his long list of requirements, you guessed it, the birds of Rhiannon. The birds of Rhiannon, the ones which can wake the dead and put the living to sleep, I want to entertain me that night, says Ysbaddadan to Culhwch. And so we learn a little more about the properties of these magical birds. Their soothing song can lull you to sleep. I've often wondered if what's implied here is that they can lull the dying to sleep too, as well as awakening the dead. After all, who wouldn't like to go as if they were just falling asleep? While there are lots of birds in Celtic stories, this kind of description is rare. The otherworld is sometimes described as being filled with beautiful birds who sing very sweetly, but usually no specific effects are ascribed to their music. However, there's at least one exception, and it's in an Irish story called The Adventures of Teg, son of Cian. This is one of those wonderful tales where a group of men sets out on a voyage and ends up visiting all sorts of otherworldly islands along the way. After a hard and frightening journey, they come to an island where they meet a woman called Clídna Fairhead. You may know her from the story of Clídna's wave. She takes them to a beautiful house where this happens. Just then they saw 3 birds fly in through an open window. One was blue with a crimson head, the next had a crimson body with a green head, and the third was pied and had a head the colour of gold. They perched in the apple tree, and each ate one of the apples and then began to sing the sweetest of melodies, all in harmony, such as would lull the sick to sleep. "These birds will accompany you on your quest," said Clídna. "They will guide you, and their minstrelsy will raise your spirits until you reach Ireland again. Neither grief nor sadness will come to you." There's another clue. Neither grief nor sadness will come to you. Teg and his men stay a short while on the island, and then they set off on their quest again. And I should tell you that although they have survived the journey so far, they're not really great sailors, and so the birds are about to come in handy. Their currach drove forward through the troughs of the sea, and the birds began to sing to them and lift up their hearts until they were merry and full of courage. They looked back to see the land they had left behind, but a magical veil of mist had already obscured it. Their craft continued on its way for a day and a half, but they were lulled into slumber by the singing of the birds, so that they knew nothing of the voyage until they reached the land of Fráech. Then they awoke, and they saw that they were in a port, and the birds ceased their singing. So it seems that the singing of Clídna's birds gave them courage on the rough seas where they had been a bit frightened earlier in the story. Not only that, but they actually managed to sleep through the worst of it, thanks to the sweet music of the birds. Admittedly, this isn't quite the same as the experience of the 7 survivors in the Welsh story, but the next examples return us to grief and the aftermath of battle once again in another Irish story called the Second Battle of Moytura. As we join this story, we find the Ysbaddadan suffering under a hard and humiliating oppression from a greedy race called the Fomhóra. Nuada, king of the Ysbaddadan, is holding a great feast, yet he seems to have lost his way a bit. He doesn't seem able to lead them in any kind of effective uprising. Then along comes Lugh, who is destined to lead them to victory against their foes. After a long exchange with the gatekeeper, Lugh gains entry to Tara and then proves himself through 3 displays of skill: a game of fidcho, which is similar to chess, a contest of strength, and finally by playing the harp to the assembled people. "Let a harp be played for us," said the hosts. Then the warrior played sleep music for the hosts and for the king on the first night, putting them to sleep from that hour to the same time the next day. He played sorrowful music so that they were crying and lamenting. He played joyful music so that they were merry and rejoicing. Again, we see the people who, this time, are under grievous oppression, coming together and experiencing things we all need in order to overcome grief: sleep, weeping, and laughter. The story continues as the Ysbaddadan go to war against the Fomhóra. They're ultimately victorious, but just as in our first story, the losses are very heavy. and many beloved warriors are killed, including Nuada. Somehow, during this war, the harp of the great god, the Dagda, has been captured, and so they go to retrieve it. Then Lu and the Dagda and Ogma went after the Favora because they had taken the Dagda's harp, Uhinya. Eventually they reached the banqueting hall where Bresh MacEllahan and Elaha MacDalbeth were. There was the harp on the wall. That is the harp in which the Dagda had bound the melodies so that they did not make a sound until he summoned them, saying, "Come Dar da Blow, come Carkerker, come summer, come winter, mouths of harps and bags and pipes." Then the harp came away from the wall, and it killed 9 men and came to the Dagda, and he played for them the 3 things by which a harper is known: sleep music, joyful music, and sorrowful music. He played sorrowful music for them so that their tearful women wept. He played joyful music for them so that their women and boys laughed. He played sleep music for them so that the hosts slept. So the 3 of them escaped unharmed, although they wanted to kill them. These 3 types of music, of sleep, joy, and sorrow, are sometimes called the 3 noble strains of music. And in this case, as in some other stories, the ability of the harper to put people to sleep so that he can escape is a nice extra. Finally, here's a text which offers an explanation for the origins of the 3 noble strains of music. This comes from a story called the Cattle Raid of Fráech in the Ulster cycle, and it tells how the goddess Boand bore triplets fathered by the Dagda's harper, each son being associated with one of the 3 noble strains of music. The harper's name was Uenya, which means childbirth, but it's a complex word which has many other meanings too. A pillar which supports, a source of support which brings relief, a junction or a union, and because of that, harmony in music. Uenya is said to be both the name of the Dagda's harper and of his harp. The Cattle Raid of Fráech says, "The harps were of gold and silver and white gold, with the forms of snakes and birds and hounds in gold and silver on them. And as the strings moved, these forms would make circuits round the men." As we join the tale, Fráech has just arrived in the camp of Queen Maeve and King Ailill, bringing his harpers with him. The harpers played then, and 12 men died from weeping and sorrow. The 3 harpers were fair and melodious, for they were the fairer ones of Uhinya, 3 brothers, Galtraid and Gentraid and Suantraid, and Boand of the She was their mother. They were named after the music that Uhinya, the Dagda's harper, played. At first, the music was sad and mournful because of the sharpness of the pains. And then it was joyful and happy because of the 2 sons. Finally, it was quiet and peaceful because of the heaviness of the birth of the last son, and he was named for the last third of the music. After that, Boand woke from her sleep. "Receive your 3 sons, O passionate Uhinya," she said, "for the music of sleep and laughter and sorrow will reach the cattle and the women of Ailill and Maeve that bring forth young. Men will die from hearing their music." You can probably see that the birds of Rhiannon and Clídna have a lot in common with the 3 noble strains of music: comfort to the sick, the dying, and those who are in grief, rest to those who are weary and traumatized, and joy and laughter to all, to remind us that we're alive and that life goes on. Even on their own, these 3 things have great power to heal wounds of the body, mind, and the spirit. When they are combined with camaraderie, with feasting and music and maybe a wee bit of intoxication, I'm sure their power to heal is hugely amplified. It's not always easy to bring this wisdom forward into our modern, often fragmented lives, but I think it's worth looking for ways to do so. You can find the stories of Clídna's Wave and Taig's Voyage to the Otherworld in this book of 4 Irish tales, which is available on my website. You'll find a link below this video.